Alexander the Great is often considered one of the greatest war generals to ever walk the face of the earth. However, Roman historian Titus Livius or Livy thought otherwise and expressed irritation in his work at the belief that Alexander was better than Roman generals. I welcome you to my YouTube channel where I explore ancient texts. The ancient texts I explore in this channel are those that have been around for thousands of years. At the moment, I'm going through From the Founding of the City by Titus Livius or Livy. This collection of books covers the history of Rome from its founding by Romulus in the 750s BCE to the time when Augustus was emperor, which was close to 0 AD. If you have not subscribed, subscribe so that you do not miss any of the videos I publish. Of course, Livy's views on Alexander the Great were tainted by his patriotism as a Roman. Indeed, when you read his books, you get the impression that he strongly believed that no other race of people in the world was better than the Romans, especially regarding war strategy. Livy discusses Alexander the Great's abilities and how he would have fared if he had attacked Rome as part of his assessment of the achievement of the Roman general Lucius Papirius Cursor, who defeated the Samnites and retook the city of Luceria from them sometime between 320 and 315 BCE. Livy writes the following about Lucius Papirius Cursor. It is beyond doubt that during that age, than which none was ever more productive of virtuous characters, there was no man in whom the Roman affairs found a more effectual support. Nay, people even marked him out in their minds as a match for Alexander the Great, in case that, having completed the conquest of Asia, he should have turned his arms on Europe. Livy points out that besides Lucius Papirius Cursor, other Roman generals had been equally or better skilled than Alexander the Great at the battleground. Livy writes, "In the annals of the magistrates and the records, we may run over whole pages of consuls and dictators, with whose bravery and successes the Roman people never once had reason to be dissatisfied. And what renders them more deserving of admiration than Alexander or any king is that some of these acted in the office of dictator, which lasted only 10 or it might be 20 days, none in a charge of longer duration than the consulship of a year. Their levies, abstracted by plebeian tribunes, often late in taking the field, recalled before the time on account of elections, amidst the very busiest efforts of the campaign, their year of office expired, sometimes the rashness, sometimes the perverseness of a colleague, proving an impediment or detriment, and finally succeeding to the unfortunate administration of a predecessor with an army of raw or indisciplined men. But on the other hand, kings, being not only free from every kind of impediment, but masters of circumstances and seasons, control all things in subserviency to their designs, themselves uncontrolled by any. So that Alexander unconquered would have encountered unconquered commanders, and will have had stakes of equal consequences pledged on the issue. Nay, the hazard had been greater on his side because the Macedonians would have had but one Alexander, who was not only liable but fond of exposing himself to casualties. The Romans would have had many equal to Alexander, both in renown and in the greatness of their exploits, any one of whom might live or die according to his destiny, without any material consequence on the public. Livy details other reasons why Alexander the Great would not have succeeded if he had decided to invade the Italian peninsula. For a start, he thought Alexander the Great would have had to face a totally different setting, especially from that of Asia. Livy writes, "The aspect of Italy would have appeared to him of a quite different nature from that of India, which he traversed in a guise of a traveler at the head of a crew of drunkards, if he had seen the forest of Apulia and the mountains of Lucania, with the vestiges of the disasters of his house, and where his uncle Alexander, king of Epirus, had been lately cut off." In another video, I did talk about the campaign of Alexander the Great's uncle, Alexander of Epirus, in the Italian peninsula and his death there. Livy also explains that unlike in Greece, Alexander the Great would not have found a population in the Italian peninsula that was awed by his charm. Livy writes, "But then, as is frequently repeated by the silliest of the Greeks, who are fond of exalting the reputation even of the Parthians at the expense of the Roman name, the danger was that the Roman people would not have had resolution to bear up against the splendor of Alexander's name, who, however, in my opinion, was not known to them even by the common fame. He also argues against the narrative that Alexander the Great was never defeated on the battlefield, which was then taken to mean that the Romans would not have defeated him. He writes, "How great soever our idea of this man's greatness may be, still it is the greatness of an individual, constituted by the successes of a little more than 10 years. And those who give it preeminence on account that the Roman people would have been defeated, though not in any entire war, yet in several battles, whereas Alexander was never once unsuccessful in a single fight, do not consider that they are comparing the actions of one man, and that a young man, with the exploits of a nation waging wars now 800 years. Livy also believed that the Romans and their allies in the peninsula were in a position to recruit more soldiers than Alexander could ever do. He writes, "In the general surveys of the age, there were rated 250,000 men, so that on every revolt of the Latin confederates, 10 legions were enlisted almost entirely in the city levy. It often happened during those years that 4 or 5 armies were employed at a time in Etruria, in Umbria, the Gauls too being at war, in Sumnium, in Lucania. Then as to all Latium, with the Sabines, and Volscians, and the Aquians, and all Campania, half of Umbria, Etruria, and the Byzantians, Marcians, Pelignians, Vestinians, and Apulians, to whom may add the whole coast of the lower sea, possessed by the Greeks from Thurii to Neapolis and Cumae, and the Samnites from thence far as Antium and Ostia. All these would have found either powerful allies to Romans or deprived of power by their arms. He would have crossed the sea with his veteran Macedonians, amounting to no more than 30,000 infantry and 4,000 horse. These mostly Thessalians. This was the wall of his strength. Had he brought with him Persians and Indians and those other nations, it would be dragging after him an encumbrance other than a support." Livy also claims that the Romans had weapons superior to those of Alexander's army. He writes, "As to arms, theirs were a buckler and long spears, those of the Romans a shield which covered the body more effectually, and a javelin, a much more forcible weapon than the spear, either in throwing or striking. The soldiers on both sides were used to steady combat and to preserve their ranks, but the Macedonians' phalanx was unapt for motion, and composed of similar parts throughout. The Roman lines, less compact, consisting of several various parts, was easily divided as occasion required, and as easily conjoined." Livy also claims that, in addition to weapons, the Roman soldiers were generally physically stronger than the soldiers that Alexander faced in Asia, and indeed more than the Macedonian soldiers. He writes, "In truth, even should events have been favorable to him at first, he would have often wished for the Persians, the Indians, and the effeminate tribes of Asia as opponents, and would have acknowledged that his wars had been waged with women, as we are told was said by Alexander, king of Epirus, after receiving his mortal wound, when comparing the wars waged in Asia by this very youth with those in which himself had been engaged." Of course, his conclusion is that there was no chance that Alexander the Great would have conquered Romans or even any part of the Italian peninsula. He writes, "Our soldiers, heavily laden with arms, may reasonably fear a body of cavalry or arrows, defiles of difficult passage, and places impassable to convoys. But they have defeated and will defeat 1,000 armies more formidable than those of Alexander and the Macedonians, provided that the same love of peace and solicitude about domestic harmony in which we now live continue permanently." If you found this video interesting, please take a moment to hit the like button. I also welcome your comments. See you in the next video.